Okay, welcome everyone. As you are filing in, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Lynette Roth, and I'm Daimler Curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum and head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Harvard Art Museums, and I will be serving as our moderator for our Q&A later on. Before we begin today's program, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we at the university strive to honor this relationship. I want to thank you all for joining us for this week's session of our series Art Talks Live, which offer an up-close look at works in our collections with our team and also with special guests, as you'll see today. You can join us on Zoom every other Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. for these short interactive talks. Just some logistics before we begin. I'm sure this is familiar to most of you by now, but we are using the webinar format. So please submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And the talk will last about 15 minutes, and we'll dedicate the last 15 minutes or so to Q&A so that we can end promptly at 1 p.m. And so now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today, our very own Elizabeth Rudy, Carl A. Weyerhaeuser Curator of Prints at the Harvard Art Museums, and our special guest, Freyda Spira, Robert L. Solley Curator of Prints and Drawings at Yale University Art Museum. And their talk today on artistic rivalry was inspired by the Harvard-Yale game and features works from both museums' collections. And so we really want to extend a special welcome to the Harvard Art Museum's friends and fellows and Yale University Art Gallery members who are joining us today in the spirit of friendly rivalry. And so with that, I turn it over to Elizabeth and Freyda.
Thanks, Lynette. Hello, I'm Elizabeth Rudy. Freyda and I have known each other for many years. And don't worry, Freyda, I won't mention how many years, but I believe this is the first time that we've had the opportunity to talk together about works of art. Our remarks today are inspired by this Saturday's football game between Harvard and Yale, or the Crimson versus the Bulldogs. This annual showdown is known on both campuses simply as the game, and this year will be the 137th time the teams have faced each other on the field. Freyda and I are going to talk about historic rivalries and competitions in the art world. Competition between artists for major commissions, for public attention, for good reviews from the critics is a constant feature of the business of being an artist. And there are myriad ways that it has played a significant role in shaping the history of art. Today, we will be exploring this topic through 4 focused examples in Europe and America, spanning the 16th to 20th centuries. Freyda will begin our conversation in the 16th century during the Renaissance.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I want to talk today about the well-documented rivalry between the courts of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and that of the Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony in the pursuit of a new printmaking technique. Here, both are shown in prints by the renowned German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer. Some artists worked for both Maximilian and Frederick, but in the context of this artistic rivalry, their favored artists strive to be the first to create a new printmaking technique that allowed woodcuts to be printed in colors and not just in black ink on white paper. Next slide, please. The earliest colored woodcuts were intended to imitate the appearance of a type of drawing on colored paper, which was much sought after by collectors. In drawings like this Albrecht Alldorfer that you see on the left, the colored paper serves as a middle tone. Alldorfer then worked towards the light by adding highlights in white opaque watercolor and towards the dark by adding crosshatching in pen and black ink. In woodcuts, these same effects are achieved when a composition is made from 2 or more woodcuts, inked in different colors, and a line block that carries the contours and crosshatching and is printed in a darker ink. You see on the right, Lucas Cranach's earliest attempt at a chiaroscuro woodcut. To achieve this dramatic effect of contrasting light and dark shades, Cranach painted a middle tone in a wash of indigo that covers the surface of the paper. The black line block was printed first, and then a second block was printed, probably with glue, onto which gold leaf was applied. The background highlights were added by scraping away the indigo off the surface of the paper. In 1507, Frederick the Wise, Cranach's patron, sent an impression to Conrad Peutinger, a counselor and artistic advisor to Emperor Maximilian. The letter addressed said that Peutinger had sent a knight in gold and silver that your princely honors painter Cranach had made in a miraculous print. Next slide, please. So impressed was Peutinger with this luxurious novelty that he commissioned the Augsburg artist Hans Birkmeyer to produce his own chiaroscuro woodcuts in 1508. In the spirit of friendly competition, Peutinger sent impressions in gold and silver on parchment to Frederick. He even asked Frederick his opinion of the novel technique, saying that he, along with his artist, came up with the idea. Mixing Maximilian's political ambitions with his artistic ones, these images show St. George and Maximilian on horseback and were printed at the time of a large imperial meeting in Augsburg, when Maximilian was trying to convince his followers to launch a crusade against the Ottomans. St. George was a great defender of the faith, a label Maximilian eagerly sought. Next slide, please. Cranach was keen to stress his priority in the inventing process. And here you see his monumental Venus dated 1508 on the cartouche, on the tree. This date is known to be a total fabrication, and it's likely that it was printed in the 15 teens. Next slide. Birkmeyer, though, soon elaborated the technique to a greater sophistication than Cranach. His most famous color print is the Lovers that you see on the right, which combines a winged death disrupting lovers in a very Italian or Venetian setting. This is the first color woodcut to have 3 colors rather than just 2 tone blocks and a line block. It also clearly emphasizes color over line. Unlike Cranach's color woodcuts, the Lovers could not be read as a coherent composition if the artist only printed the line block. It's just not enough. Only with the addition of the color blocks is the image comprehensible. This kind of coordination took a very specialized skill and many participants. And you can see the name of the printer, Joost de Necker from Augsburg, in the letterpress below the image. Elizabeth?
Thanks, Freyda. Now I'll jump 300 years to the 19th century and to Paris, which was a center of the contemporary art world in Europe at that time. Specifically, I'd like to focus on an opposition of schools of painting supposedly embodied by the artists Delacroix and Ingres. This cartoon was published in 1848 as a pictorial review of the annual exhibition of contemporary art called the Salon. It was one of many such cartoons that solidified for the public and for generations of art historians afterward, a stark opposition between the artists and their approaches to art making. Based off on ponies, or rather toy horses that are animated, they joust in front of the Institute of Fine Arts. Their battle is for dominance within the art establishment and within history. Delacroix is on the left, brandishing a long paintbrush, and Ingres is on the right, thrusting a porte-crayon, which is a wood or metal implement into which a piece of graphite or chalk would be fastened at the top. In other words, they represent pigment versus pencil, color versus drawing. The argument here, and the subsequent myth that became entrenched in historical memory, is first that these artists were the figureheads of 2 identifiable specific movements, and second, that they were complete dialectical opposites. Scholars have debunked both these claims. Ingres was not a slavish follower of a neoclassical school, and Delacroix never wanted to be seen as embodying any kind of movement that was devoid of adherence to drawing and classicism. But the mythology stuck, and the story was color, exemplified by the work of the 17th century painter Rubens, versus line, exemplified by the work of the Renaissance artist Raphael. Art theory was layered on top, and the story became a revision of the Renaissance argumentation over disegno, or line, and colore, or color. And then stories of personal animus between the artists, most of them apocryphal, were thrown in for good measure. Stories of their public statements about and against each other circulated in the press. In the cult of celebrity, it was a showdown and face-off of 2 male giants. The scholar Andrew Carrington Shelton has pointed out that the dominant myth of Delacroix versus Ingres was largely invented by art critics. His research has shown that some kind of face-off had been percolating for decades, but with different artists in the position of Delacroix, who was the younger artist. That is to say, Ingres had been pitted against artists such as Horace Vernet, among others, before some kind of consensus seemed to settle on the Ingres-Delacroix opposition. So the myth, in other words, was arbitrary from the start and wholly flawed as a narrative. In addition to the false dichotomy, the narrative of Delacroix versus Ingres left a lot of artists and stories out of the picture, so to speak. Take, for instance, this painter Antoinette Cécile Audebourg, who showed over 100 paintings at the Salon in the first half of the 19th century. Her work, represented in one painted portrait here, can generally be described as neoclassical, but she worked in a different, distinct mode that was officially sanctioned, royally favored. It was a style known as the troubadour style, and it would thrive in different permutations until the end of the century. Still, as evidenced by these two paintings, there was some kernel of truth to the Delacroix versus Ingres myth, which is why it stuck. Delacroix admired Rubens so much that he made copies of the Baroque painter's work, such as this portrait of Suzanne Fourmont on the left. And Ingres was famously obsessed with Raphael, considering him to be the ultimate, the best painter. Like Delacroix, he copied the works of his heroes and imagined scenes from his life, such as the work on the right, in which he portrays Raphael painting his model and muse, known as the Fornarina, who sits on his lap. The story of these two artists' similarities and differences is complex and entangled, but there's something about the simplicity of a face-off, of a clear opposition that satisfied the public, and I dare say it does today. The conceit of a monolithic neoclassicism versus other styles intensified as the 19th century rolled on. Here, the neoclassical mode is literally embodied by the bespectacled, older, nude man on the right. He holds a large palette and prepares to strike the smaller man in front of him with his maul stick, which was a large wooden rod that painters used to steady their hands, especially when working on huge canvases. The man before him is dressed in the provincial clothes and shoes of a peasant, and he clasps a large paintbrush. The personification of the realist approach to painting, he is meant to embody the kind of impasto painting, the direct application of pigment to the canvas that many artists pursued at this time. Here again, we're looking at the spurious battle between pigment and drawing, color and line. Both figures echo the protagonists from Jacques-Louis David's famous painting, The Intervention of the Sabines, which was a rallying cry for peace and reconciliation and dates to 1799. In these allusions, the artist of the caricature, Daumier, wittily situates the 19th century debate between schools in the previous century. He asserts that this pitting of artists as styles is an outmoded, reductionist way of thinking. One factor that may have played a role in Daumier's critique here is his own approach to painting. Daumier was a devotee of the neoclassical approach and specifically the legacy of David, but he painted in a realist style. So I like to think he's making the point that an artist never has to be one thing or another, have an allegiance to one theory of painting or another, but an artist can be and do multiple things at once. One context in which artists did and still do face off willingly is in competitions for major commissions. This is a central feature of architecture where firms submit drawings of proposed designs, and it's also a mainstay of the planning for public memorials. These kinds of competitions are often important in their own right, as the winning and losing designs can have lasting impacts on the field, as did the examples that Freyda and I will now share. In 1922, an international competition was launched for a new headquarters for the Chicago Tribune. The competition was launched on the 75th anniversary of the newspaper and offered a large cash prize. More than 260 submissions were made from 23 different countries. The winners were New York-based architects Raymond Hood and John Mead Hollows, and their neo-Gothic design still features in the Chicago landscape today. The year after the competition, however, a beautiful book was published illustrating all of the competing designs for the project. I'm showing scans of just 5 of those designs here to give a sense of the range of whimsy, creativity, and possibility expressed in those submissions. While they may not all have won prizes, everyone in the field and beyond had the opportunity to see those ideas and get inspired by them. One of the most distinctive submissions to the competition was a design by Walter Gropius and his partner, Adolphe Meyer. Gropius, pictured here with one of their drawings for the tower, was the founder of the Bauhaus School of Art. This design, which was showcased at a Bauhaus exhibition in 1923, sought to be thoroughly modern without explicit references to past historical form. These elevation drawings feature the steel structure and simplified geometry of the aesthetic. If they feel somewhat familiar to our 21st century eyes, that's because this approach would be adopted by subsequent generations of architects, and today the style dominates many urban landscapes. Gropius immigrated to the United States in 1937 and joined Harvard's Department of Architecture. The Busch-Reisinger Museum, which is part of the Harvard Art Museums, houses the largest collection of Bauhaus works outside of Germany, and that includes these drawings. The archive and collection are due to the efforts of Gropius and his fellow artists, teachers, and students. Most recently, the Harvard Art Museums published a beautiful book on that legacy and archive, which includes contributions from several scholars and a preface authored by Lynette. It was edited by my colleague Laura Muir, who curated a major exhibition on this subject in 2019. The book, titled Object Lessons, The Bauhaus in Harvard, tells the stories of works by a range of Bauhaus artists, many of whom brought their energy and creativity to the US in the 1930s and 40s. Another transformative architect, Maya Lin, has long been associated with Yale and will be the focus of Freyda's concluding remarks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. In 1981, Maya Lin gained national recognition while an undergraduate at Yale. In her senior year, she proposed the winning design for the memorial to the fallen soldiers of the Vietnam War to be built on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Lin's design was selected from more than 1,400 submissions. Lin's minimal plan was in sharp contrast to the traditional format for memorials, which usually included figurative, heroic sculpture. The design aroused a great deal of controversy, reflecting the lack of resolution of over this national conflict, the war, as well as a lack of consensus over what constituted an appropriate memorial at the end of the 20th century. I'm showing you one of the studies in pastel with a site map pasted onto the sheet and annotated by Lin herself. She sought to have her monument relate directly to the presence of both the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, and to tie the three together physically and historically. Next slide, please. This is her memory of how she decided to enter the competition, and I quote, "One of my classmates had seen a poster for a competition for the design of a Vietnam memorial. And since we had just completed an assignment for the design of a memorial to World War III, we chose to end the architecture and design class with this project. In my research for the World War III assignment, I had noticed how memorials often focused on the victor rather than on each of the individual soldiers. This changed in Europe with designs for memorials for World War I. Coincidentally, a few weeks before I submitted the design to one of my professors, Vincent Scully, in a seminar I was taking, he described one of the World War I memorials I had previously studied. In his description, he talked about it as a journey towards an awareness of loss. I realized how close the experience he described was to my design for the Vietnam Memorial, though formally they couldn't have been more different. And I started writing about my design while I was still in his class," end quote. To me, a native Washingtonian, her memorial is one of the most significant and emotive on the mall. It was also the first designed by a woman. Combining her interest in art, architecture, and design, the memorial was imagined as a V-shaped form that would be literally carved into the landscape. When she was conceiving of the design, Lin visited the site and contemplated, quote, "taking a knife and cutting into the earth, opening it up. The initial violence that in time would heal," end quote. The completed memorial is composed of a black granite wall engraved with the names of over 58,000 individuals who lost their lives in service or remain missing. And just a plug, these works by Lin are now hanging in our exhibition on the basis of art, 150 Years of Women at Yale, that was curated by my colleague, Lisa Hodomarsky, and will be up until February. Thank you.
Thank you, Freyda. That concludes our remarks, and now I'll turn things back over to you, Lynette.
Great. Thank you both so much for a real whirlwind tour through Europe and the United States and across centuries. And it really, I think, made clear that artistic rivalries are also beloved in some ways by not just artists, but also their supporters and the press. And actually the wonderful plug, thank you for our Bauhaus book from Elizabeth, but also the Maya Lin gift, Promise to Yale, actually really opened this up in interesting ways, because as you were both talking initially, I kept thinking, about how male this notion of artistic rivalry actually is. I was thinking of Sebastian Smee's recent book, The Art of Rivalry, and that mostly when we think about that topic, right, we tend to think about male artists. So I was glad to see Maya Lin addressed here, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about that as you were putting together this talk. Were there other examples that you came across of women in the history of art that would have also fit into this rubric?
Well, of course, this idea of artistic rivalry goes back to ancient mythology, and you're right, it's a very male-dominated story. I'm trying to think of other women. I know that I was very interested and taken with the idea of working on a woman artist, because we're celebrating 150 years of women at the art school and also 50 years of women as undergraduates at Yale. Unfortunately, a lot of the art I study, there are very few women artists, and they seem to always be in competition with men. And so I haven't been able to uncover any other purely female rivalries.
I think we're on the cusp of that in sort of the field of art history. There's the big show that's going to happen at the Baltimore Museum of Art, right, that our colleague is organizing on women artists in the Renaissance. And I think she's going on until Anjali Banta, she's going up until 1900, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some graduate students who, at least at Harvard, who are specifically pursuing dissertations on female artists from the pre-modern period. So I feel as though this story is being rewritten, and we'll just have to pay attention and keep see what happens.
Great, thank you both so much. We have a few questions that have filtered into our Q&A, along with a lot of congratulations and thanks for this wonderful conversation and collaboration between the two of you. One question that came up was how much of the neoclassical versus realism in the 19th century French art was politically motivated?
Yes, all of it. That's exactly right. I mean, it was all enmeshed. And it was a story about the avant-garde versus the establishment as well. So you have several layers at play, yeah. Certainly.
And it's the same battle that's going on in the Renaissance between line and color. It's very political and very sort of nationalist based.
Great, thanks. Here we also have a prompt to talk about the controversy. So this is for you, Freyda, controversy over Lin's memorial as fitting into earlier binary rivals, abstract versus figuration.
Yeah, so when we think about memorials, we often think about, sort of Rodin and these large sculptural figures. And, in a certain sense, if you walk through the mall in Washington, you get an entire history of what memorials look like. This idea of abstraction, this idea of embedding something into the landscape was very critical to Lin, who was very much interested in the environment and nature, sort of, before we all paid attention. And, I think that it still sits as a sort of an incredibly modern vision when you see it in the context of the Washington Mall. With Lincoln and with the Washington Memorial, it still stands out as something incredibly different and an incredibly new way of thinking.
Freyda, before you had, I hadn't read or seen that quote before, and as you were reading it, I was sort of awakened to the violence of the memorial, the cutting of the earth, putting this angular stone into the landscape. I hadn't been aware of that before, and that was really eye-opening.
And so transformative, really, for how, after Maya Lin, how we began to think about monuments and the entire development of the sort of anti-monument, which is of course so relevant in thinking about monuments in our culture today, and who they represent and how they do that. So a great reminder of that. Freyda, could you say a little bit more about that gift to Yale? Did I see that it was from the artist directly?
Yes. Yeah, so we've been in contact with obviously a lot of our alums as we've been working on the exhibition on the basis of art. And Maya has always been incredibly connected with Yale, working on sort of the fountain of the fountain table that's on campus in front of Sterling Library as well. And this is a wonderful addition to our collection. We don't have a lot of works by her. And when she was approached about doing the exhibition, we also started talking about this gift. And the pastels, they're also collaged together. She was building ideas on top of ideas, which I didn't really talk about, but you could sort of see the seams inside of the drawings where she pasted things on top. But it really is kind of a remarkable gift, and we're so grateful to have this connection with a lot of the artists that came through the Yale Art School.
That's great, and in many ways it was a wonderful tie to the Gropius archive and to the connection of Gropius to the Busch-Reisinger Museum and to Harvard. And we actually have a comment or question on that as well for you, Elizabeth, about seeing Gropius's losing design as being as noteworthy as the hood design that was built, and whether there were other examples of non-winners who influenced. Maybe
Yes.
even not just in that context, but more broadly, thinking about artistic competitions.
Yes, I mean, many of the non-winning submissions to the competition for history painting in France, for example, those were always significant, because if you're a finalist, everyone's paying attention to the finalists are, not just whoever gets the medal and gets to go to Rome. So that's another glaring example. But yes, there were several other submissions to the 1922 competition that had lasting impact and were extremely influential. I've forgotten, the artist's name has fallen out of my head, but the person who won second prize was truly beloved by one of the jurists, and ended up getting, it was not an American competitor, but ended up getting a number of major commissions as a result of the submission. And then there was another, it's a whimsical one where the design for the building was that of a neoclassical Doric column. And there was a pun on the newspaper, and so the form was a column, but that, it didn't just get laughs. I mean, there were cartoonists and caricaturists who reproduced it in their own designs, and through that, but also through people being aware of the drawings, mainly through that publication, it garnered attention and notoriety.
Well, great. Thank you both. We are at the end of our questions, and we are just at time. So I ask you, would either of you like to say a final word on the topic?
Go Yale.
Go Harvard.
Oh, I anticipated that. I anticipated that. Well, thank you, Freyda, so much for joining us today. And Elizabeth, as always, great to have you on Art Talks Live. You will, everyone, after you leave the session, get a survey, and hope you take a moment to complete that. It is helpful still to have your feedback on these talks. And join us in 2 weeks' time on Tuesday, November 30th for our next Art Talk Live, and when actually I will be in conversation that week with contemporary German artist Hans Christian Schinck about a recent acquisition from his series Traffic Projects German Unity. And I'm going to talk with Hans Christian about the work, the issues the work raises about German identity from the time when the country was first reunified to this day. And of course, please check out our online calendar for more information about these and other upcoming programs. And please do visit the museum in person with an online reservation and bring your proof of vaccination. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. And thanks again, Freyda and Elizabeth, and as always to Erica behind the scenes.